Tonight, we unravel one of history's most shocking and sudden betrayals. Imagine an order of knights, celebrated as the heroes of Christendom for 2 centuries, the inventors of international banking, wealthier than kings and answerable only to the Pope, an organization so powerful, it was considered untouchable. Then, in a single day, on a Friday the 13th, they vanished. The trap was set in absolute secrecy by a king drowning in debt. At dawn, across an entire kingdom, thousands of these legendary warriors were dragged from their beds, arrested, and thrown into dungeons. Their vast wealth disappeared. Their grand master was burned at the stake, uttering a curse that would see both a king and a pope dead within a year. They were accused of monstrous crimes, spitting on the cross, worshipping a demonic head named Baphomet, and secret, blasphemous rituals. Were they truly heretics hiding a dark secret? Or were they the victims of the most successful smear campaign in history? Destroyed by a greedy king for their gold? The truth is a story of faith and finance, of unimaginable courage and ruthless conspiracy. A mystery that echoes to this day, leaving one question burning through the centuries: what truly happened to the Knights Templar? Welcome back to Mysteries of the Middle Ages. Tonight, our journey does not begin with the clash of swords or the proclamations of kings. It begins in silence. I invite you to find a comfortable space, to dim the lights of the modern world, and to let the noise of your day fade into a distant hum. Allow your breathing to slow, and let your mind become a quiet, open vessel, ready to be filled with the echoes of a time long past. For the story we have just outlined is one woven from threads of immense power, profound faith, and a darkness that gathered with terrifying speed. Our destination is a specific moment, suspended in time. It is the evening of Thursday, the 12th of October, in the year of our Lord, 1307. Imagine, if you will, the city of Paris, not the sprawling, luminous metropolis of today, but a medieval heart of stone and timber, huddled on the banks of the river Seine. As dusk deepens into night, a damp chill rises from the water, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, wet earth, and the faint, sweet smell of decaying leaves. The great Gothic marvel of Notre Dame is a dark silhouette against a sky pricked with cold, distant stars. The day's clamor, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the shouts of merchants, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, has subsided. It has been replaced by a fragile tranquility, a silence pregnant with secrets. All across the kingdom of France, from the windswept coasts of Normandy to the sun-baked lands of Provence, this same quiet blankets the land, and within this quiet, behind the thick, unyielding walls of hundreds of fortified commanderies, castles, and preceptories, thousands of men are preparing for sleep. These are the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. We know them, simply, as the Knights Templar. Let us draw closer. Let us peer through the veil of centuries and witness them in these final, unknowing hours. Here, in a dormitory, the air is cold. The only light is a single tallow candle sputtering in a corner, casting long, dancing shadows that make the stone walls seem to breathe. On simple wooden cots lie the warrior monks. Some are knights, men of noble birth, whose bodies are maps of old scars from battles fought in the faraway Holy Land. Their sleep is heavy, perhaps filled with dreams of desert sun and the heat of righteous combat. Beside their beds, their swords rest in their scabbards, silent, loyal companions that have tasted the blood of Saracens and defended Christian pilgrims. They feel secure. They are in their own fortress, in a friendly kingdom, under the protection of God and the Pope. There is no enemy here. In another part of the building, sleeping on rougher pallets, are the sergeants. These are men from common stock, stonemasons, farmers, merchants, who pledged their lives to the order. They are the backbone, the artisans and administrators, the soldiers who fought with spear and crossbow. Their hands are calloused, their faces weathered. They too sleep a sleep of the weary and the just. And nearby, in a small, austere cell, an old chaplain, his face a fine web of wrinkles, murmurs the last of his evening prayers, his rosary beads clicking softly in the gloom. He prays for the souls of his brethren, for the protection of the order, and for the eventual reclamation of Jerusalem. His faith is as solid and as ancient as the stone floor beneath his knees. This scene of pious slumber repeats itself in countless Templar houses across the land. From the Grand Paris Temple, a formidable fortress within a city that served as the de facto treasury of France, to the smallest rural farmstead. The rhythm of the night is the same. It is a rhythm of discipline, prayer, and a deep, unshakable belief in their own purpose and their own righteousness. They are the fist of the papacy, the guardians of Christendom's wealth, the heroes of the Crusades. For nearly 2 centuries, their white mantles, emblazoned with the stark blood-red cross, have been a symbol of unwavering strength and divine sanction. To understand what is about to happen, you must first grasp the sheer scale of their existence. The Knights Templar were not merely a military order. They had become something far greater, something the world had never seen before. They were a multinational corporation, a sprawling financial web whose gossamer strands connected every corner of Europe. They owned vast tracts of land, forests, mills, and vineyards. They commanded a fleet of ships that dominated the Mediterranean trade. They perfected international banking, creating a system of credit notes that allowed a pilgrim to deposit his fortune in London and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem. A revolutionary concept that fueled the medieval economy. Kings and popes were their debtors. Nobles entrusted their estates to Templar administration when they went on crusade. The order was sovereign, a state within states, answerable to no king, no bishop, no earthly power save the Pope himself in Rome. This unparalleled privilege, granted to them in their heroic youth, had become, in their wealthy maturity, a source of immense envy and suspicion. They were seen as arrogant, secretive, a law unto themselves. Their fortresses were not just homes, they were vaults. Their rituals, conducted behind closed doors, were a mystery to the outside world, a blank canvas onto which the fearful and the jealous could paint the most lurid pictures. And on this particular night, the 12th of October, 1307, while the Templars sleep their righteous sleep, other lights burn late in Paris, not the humble candles of a monastery, but the bright, steady lamps of a royal chamber in the Louvre Palace. Here, there is no peace, there is only the cold, meticulous execution of a plan of breathtaking audacity and chilling precision. Imagine the scratch of a quill on parchment, moving with relentless speed under the hand of a royal clerk. Imagine the soft hiss of crimson wax melting over a flame, ready to seal a secret decree. These are the sounds of the coming storm. These are the sounds of a conspiracy taking its final, irreversible shape. The architect of this storm is a man whose piety was matched only by his ruthlessness. King Philip IV of France. Known to history as Philip the Fair, his kingdom was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the very order he was about to destroy. He saw in the Templars not a holy brotherhood, but a vault to be plundered, and an obstacle to his dream of absolute royal authority. The orders being drafted on this night were not declarations of war. They were arrest warrants, hundreds upon hundreds of them, each bearing the name of a Templar, from the Grand Master Jacques de Molay down to the humblest lay brother. These letters, tied with ribbon and sealed with the royal signet, were already in the hands of royal bailiffs and seneschals across the entirety of France. The instructions were simple and terrifying. Do not open this letter until the first light of dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, and when you do, you are to act immediately, and without fail. And so, the trap was set. A net, invisible and silent, had been cast over an entire kingdom. Every knot was tied, every exit sealed, while the Templars dreamt of past glories. Their future was being written in ink and sealed in wax by a desperate king. The very ground beneath their fortresses was about to give way. The air of tranquility was a lie. The silence was not peace, it was the deafening quiet before an avalanche. The silence was not peace, it was the deafening quiet before an avalanche. And to understand the forces that set this avalanche in motion, to truly comprehend how a brotherhood so revered could be targeted for annihilation, we must leave the cold Parisian night of 1307 and journey back nearly 200 years. We must travel to the very source, not to the halls of power in Europe, but to the sun-scorched and blood-soaked roads of the Holy Land. Following the success of the First Crusade, the dream of pilgrimage to Jerusalem became a reality for thousands of devout Christians. But the reality was a brutal one. The final stretch of the journey, from the port cities on the coast to the holy sites inland, was a treacherous gauntlet. The land was not truly pacified. Bandit gangs and Saracen raiding parties lurked in the rocky hills and narrow passes, preying on the endless stream of vulnerable travelers. These pilgrims, often unarmed and carrying their life savings, were easy targets. They came seeking spiritual salvation but frequently met a violent end. The very roads to God were paved with fear and death. It was in response to this chaos that a new idea took root. Around the year 1119, a French nobleman from Champagne, a knight named Hugues de Payens, along with 8 of his kinsmen and companions, came before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Their proposal was as radical as it was simple. They wished to form a new kind of religious order, a monastic brotherhood dedicated not to quiet contemplation in a cloister, but to active, armed protection of the pilgrimage routes. They sought no riches for themselves, only a purpose. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The name was an accurate description. They were truly poor, an enduring legend, later immortalized on their official seal, tells that Hugues de Payens and his co-founder, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, were so lacking in resources that they had to share a single horse. This image of 2 knights on one steed became a powerful symbol of their initial poverty and, more importantly, of the fraternal bond that was the bedrock of their order. King Baldwin, seeing the value in their mission, granted them a headquarters in a wing of his palace, which stood on the hallowed ground of the Temple Mount, the site believed to be that of Solomon's ancient temple. From this location, they derived their famous name, the Knights of the Temple, or the Templars. For nearly a decade, they remained a small, obscure fraternity, respected for their courage but too few in number to make a significant impact. The moment that transformed their destiny occurred not in Jerusalem, but back in France, at the Council of Troyes in 1129. There, Hugues de Payens found the most powerful advocate in all of Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot of immense spiritual authority, a man whose words could launch crusades and sway popes. In the Templars, Bernard saw the embodiment of a revolutionary ideal, the perfect synthesis of the monk and the knight. He championed their cause, writing a famous treatise, in praise of the new knighthood, which articulated their unique status. He argued that a Templar, in killing an enemy of Christ, was not committing homicide but malicide, the righteous destruction of evil itself. It was a theological masterstroke that sanctified their violence. With Bernard's powerful endorsement, the Church granted the Templars its official recognition and a formal rule to govern their lives. This papal sanction was the spark that lit a wildfire of support across Europe. Donations began to flood in. Kings, queens, and nobles, eager to contribute to the defense of the Holy Land, bequeathed vast tracts of land, castles, farms, and fortunes to the order. In a remarkably short time, the Templars established a network of commanderies, or preceptories, that spanned the continent, from England to Spain, from France to Hungary. But their most profound and lasting innovation was not military, it was economic. They used their continent-wide network to create a system that solved the single greatest problem for pilgrims and crusaders: the danger of transporting wealth. They pioneered a system of credit. A nobleman in Paris could deposit a sum of gold at the local temple and receive a letter, written in a complex cipher, attesting to the deposit. He could then travel to the Holy Land with only this light, unassuming piece of parchment. Upon arrival in Acre or Jerusalem, He could present the letter to the Templar commandery there and withdraw the equivalent sum in local currency. It was the world's first large-scale, international banking system, a revolutionary concept that made them the most trusted and essential financial institution of the age. They became the bankers to popes and kings, the guardians of royal treasuries, and the administrators of vast estates. Their power was solidified by a series of papal decrees. Most importantly, the bull Omne Datum Optimum in 1139. This and subsequent pronouncements granted them unprecedented privileges. They were exempted from all local taxes. They were allowed to build their own churches and bury their own dead. Most critically, they were declared to be answerable to no earthly authority, no king, no bishop, no prince, except for the Pope himself. The poor knights who once shared a horse had become the masters of a financial empire, a sovereign entity operating across national borders, a state within states, seemingly untouchable and accountable to no one but God's vicar in Rome. They were a sovereign entity operating across national borders, a state within states, seemingly untouchable and accountable to no one but God's vicar in Rome. But this vast financial power, this intricate web of wealth and influence, was built upon a much simpler and more brutal foundation, the vow and the sword. To truly understand the Templar, one must look past the counting tables and the legal charters and onto the training grounds and the blood-soaked battlefields of the East. The core of the order was not the banker, it was the warrior monk. To become a Templar was to willingly undergo a form of living death and rebirth. A recruit, whether a high-born noble or a common man at arms, surrendered everything. He took the 3 monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, his personal wealth, his lands, his very name were absorbed into the collective identity of the order. He owned nothing, not even the simple brown or black mantle of his rank, nor the warhorse he rode into battle. These belonged to the temple. His life became a rigid cycle of prayer and combat readiness, governed by a strict rule. The day began before sunrise with prayers in a cold chapel, followed by Mass, and was punctuated by the canonical hours of worship. Meals were eaten in silence, listening to a reading from the Scriptures. It was the austere, disciplined life of a cloistered monk. But their monastery was the battlefield, and their form of worship was disciplined violence. In between prayers, hours were spent in grueling training. They drilled relentlessly, perfecting the maneuvers that made them the most feared heavy cavalry in the world. Their signature tactic was the squadron charge, a tightly packed, wedge-shaped formation of knights on powerful destriers that would accelerate into a seemingly unstoppable wave of iron and faith. Designed to shatter enemy infantry and punch through the lines of opposing cavalry. In an age where individual knights often fought for personal glory, the Templars fought as one body, a single weapon wielded with terrifying precision. Their code was absolute. The battle banner, the black and white bossant, was their sacred rallying point. Its name came from an old French word for a piebald horse, and its colors symbolized their nature, fair and peaceful to Christians, but black and terrible to their enemies. As long as the Bosant was flying, no Templar was permitted to leave the field of battle, to retreat without orders, to break formation, or to surrender was the ultimate dishonor, a sin that could lead to being stripped of their mantle and expelled from the order in shame. They were expected to fight to the last man, and time and again, they did exactly that. This reputation for unshakable discipline and fanatical courage was earned with an ocean of their own blood. At battles like Montgizard, a small force of Templars spearheaded an attack that annihilated a vastly superior army under the command of Saladin himself. But their history is also a litany of heroic, near-suicidal sacrifices. They were the vanguard, the rearguard, the force thrown into the most desperate situations. At the disastrous Battle of Haram, they were nearly wiped out. At the Horns of Haddon in 1187, the cataclysmic defeat that led to Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem, the captured Templars were offered a choice: convert to Islam or die. Almost every single one of them chose martyrdom, kneeling to be beheaded rather than renounce their faith. This was the image of the Templar that burned in the European imagination: the pious, incorruptible warrior, the ultimate defender of the faith, a man who feared God so much that he feared death not at all. This heroic ideal was the moral capital upon which their entire empire was built. But even the most profound faith is tested by the shifting sands of time and politics. By the middle of the 13th century, the great crusading fire in Europe had dwindled to embers. Kings and barons were more consumed with their own local wars. The vast expense of maintaining the vulnerable Crusader states became a heavy burden. The Holy Land, once the singular focus of Western Christendom, began to feel like a lost cause. The Templars and their fellow military orders, the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, became the permanent, professional army of a kingdom living on borrowed time. The final, catastrophic blow fell in the spring of 1291. The city of Acre, the last great Christian stronghold on the mainland, found itself besieged by the enormous, technologically superior army of the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Al-Ashraf Khalil. The siege of Acre was the final, desperate stand of the Crusader dream. The Templar Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, personally commanded the defense of the city. For weeks, they endured a relentless bombardment from massive siege engines that pulverized the city's ancient walls. The Templars fought with the ferocity of cornered lions, leading nighttime raids and defending every breach in the walls. But the end was inevitable. On May 18th, the Mamluks breached the main walls, and the city descended into a hell of street-to-street fighting. Grand Master de Beaujeu was mortally wounded while rallying his men. The last defenders, including the remaining Templars, retreated to their own massive, fortified compound by the sea. For 10 more days, this fortress within a city held out. It was the last patch of Christian soil in the Holy Land. Finally, the Mamluk engineers succeeded in undermining its main tower. As the Mamluk forces charged in, the tower collapsed, crushing attacker and defender alike in a final, apocalyptic cloud of dust and rubble. Acre had fallen. The Holy Land was lost for good. The few surviving Templars escaped by boat to the island of Cyprus. The great 200-year war for which they had been created was over. Their mission, the sacred purpose that had defined their existence and justified their immense privileges, had been rendered obsolete. They were now a standing army with no war to fight, a brotherhood of holy warriors with nothing left to defend. They were an organization designed as a solution to a problem that no longer existed. This hollowing out of their very reason for being left them in a dangerously vulnerable position. They were still fabulously wealthy, powerful, and secretive, but the heroic justification for that power was gone, lost in the ruins of Acre. They were an anomaly, a relic of a bygone age, and in the courts of Europe, where envy and suspicion had long simmered, their new purposelessness made them a target. The heroes had come home, but home was about to become their most dangerous enemy. The heroes had come home, but home was about to become their most dangerous enemy. And in the heart of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, that enemy sat upon the throne of France. His gaze was cold, his patience was thin, and his treasury was empty. His name was Philip IV, but he was known to history as Philippe le Bel, Philip the Fair. The name was not a comment on his justice, but on his striking, almost unnerving physical appearance. Contemporaries described him as exceptionally tall, handsome, and strangely still, with a placid, emotionless face that betrayed nothing of the churning thoughts within. He seemed to some more like an impassive marble statue of a king than a man of flesh and blood. This outward calm, however, masked a will of pure iron and an ambition that was as profound as it was utterly ruthless. Philip was a new kind of monarch. He did not see himself as a feudal lord, merely the first among a group of powerful nobles. He saw himself as the absolute sovereign, the living embodiment of a centralized and sacred French state. In his mind, his will was the will of France, and the will of France was the will of God. He was a deeply, almost chillingly pious man, but his faith was a tool and a justification for his own power. He believed he had been chosen by God to forge a stronger, more glorious kingdom, and any action, no matter how duplicitous or cruel, was therefore permissible if it served this holy purpose. He was a king who could order a man to be burned at the stake in the morning and then kneel in sincere prayer for the good of the realm in the afternoon. Seeing no moral contradiction between the two acts, his divine mission, however, was ruinously expensive. Philip's reign was defined by near constant warfare. He waged long, draining campaigns against King Edward I of England for control of territories in Gascony, and he fought a brutal, endless war to subdue the fiercely independent and wealthy cities of Flanders. These wars required massive armies, and armies required a river of silver that Philip's kingdom simply did not possess. The French crown was perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. To fund his ambitions, he resorted to measures that were both innovative and destructive. He became known as the Forger King for his repeated policy of currency debasement. He would recall the silver coins of the realm, melt them down, mix in cheaper base metals, and then reissue them at their old face value, forcing his subjects to accept the debased currency. It was a form of state-sponsored theft that caused rampant inflation and sparked riots among the populace. But Philip was unmoved. The needs of his state were paramount. His desperate search for revenue soon led him down a darker, more predatory path, one that would serve as a grim dress rehearsal for the events of 1307. He turned his attention to the Jewish population of France. For centuries, they had served as the kingdom's moneylenders, a vital but often resented economic cog in a society where Christians were forbidden from charging interest on loans. This made them a convenient and deeply unpopular target. In the summer of 1306, Philip put a meticulously organized plan into action. In a single, coordinated strike across the entire kingdom, all Jews were arrested, their property was confiscated, their financial records were seized, and all debts owed to them were declared payable to the crown. Then, stripped of everything they owned, they were summarily expelled from France. The operation was a masterpiece of cold, logistical cruelty. It provided a desperately needed infusion of cash into the royal treasury. And, more importantly, it proved to Philip that a secret, nationwide operation against a specific, wealthy group was not only possible, but shockingly effective. Philip's ambition was not limited to his own subjects. He could not tolerate any rival power center, especially one that claimed authority over him. His most famous conflict was not with another king, but with the Pope himself. Boniface VIII. Boniface was a haughty and powerful pontiff who championed the doctrine of papal supremacy over all secular rulers. Philip, with his own profound sense of divine right, saw this as an intolerable challenge to his sovereignty. The two great powers of the medieval world, the spiritual and the temporal, clashed in a titanic struggle for dominance. Philip's lawyers launched a vicious propaganda campaign to discredit the Pope, accusing him of heresy and immorality, while Philip defied papal decrees and taxed the French clergy to fund his wars. The conflict reached a shocking and unprecedented climax in 1303 at the town of Anagni, the Pope's summer residence. Philip's chief minister and enforcer, a ruthless lawyer named Guillaume de Nogaret, led a small force of soldiers that stormed the papal palace. They confronted the 86-year-old pontiff, holding him prisoner for 3 days, reportedly slapping him and threatening him with execution. The local townspeople eventually rose up and freed the Pope. The damage was done. Boniface, humiliated and broken, died within a month. The outrage of Anagni sent a shockwave through Christendom. Philip had laid violent hands on the Vicar of Christ and had, essentially, gotten away with it. He had faced down the papacy and won. The next pope, Clement V, was a Frenchman, a much weaker and more pliable figure, who soon took the historic step of moving the entire papal court from Rome to Avignon in southern France, placing it firmly under the shadow and influence of the French crown. Now, see the board as Philip saw it. He was a king who believed his authority was absolute, a king who had debased his currency, persecuted and plundered an entire population, and brought the papacy itself to heel. He sits in his palace in Paris, and across the city looms the imposing, fortified walls of the Templar temple, a fortress within his own capital. He knows that behind those walls lies a vast, untouchable fortune. He knows this fortune is managed by a secretive order of soldiers who pay him no taxes, obey no laws but their own, and whose sole allegiance is to a pope whom he now effectively controls. He sees them as a cyst within his kingdom, a wealthy, sovereign, and deeply irritating anomaly. The fall of Acre, which had stripped the Templars of their sacred purpose, had also made them critically vulnerable. They were no longer the untouchable heroes of a holy war. They were now just a very, very rich organization with a questionable reason for existing. For a king like Philip, a man with an insatiable need for money and an unshakable belief in his own supreme authority, this was an intolerable situation. The thought must have formed, cold and pragmatic, in the chambers of his mind. He had done it before. With the Jews, he had a proven playbook. He had the administrative machinery. He had a weak pope who would bend to his will. The Templars' legendary secrecy, once a source of their mystique and power, now became their greatest liability. It made them the perfect blank canvas onto which any accusation, no matter how lurid, could be painted. He could frame his royal greed as a holy duty, a necessary act to cleanse the kingdom of a corrupt and heretical order. The motive was clear. It was not just about the money, though the money was a staggering temptation. It was about absolute power. It was about forging a new France, a unified state with one king, one law, and one authority. And the Knights Templar, with their wealth, their transnational privileges, and their independent allegiance, stood directly in his way. And the Knights Templar, with their wealth, their transnational privileges, and their independent allegiance, stood directly in his way. For a man like Philip the Fair, an obstacle was not something to be negotiated with, it was something to be obliterated. The decision, once made, was pursued with the cold, relentless logic of a chess master. But an attack on the celebrated heroes of the Crusades, an order under the direct protection of the Holy See, could not be framed as a simple seizure of assets. It had to be a righteous act, a moral crusade. Philip needed more than a pretext. He needed a narrative, a story so vile and shocking that it would turn public opinion against the Templars with the force of a tidal wave, justifying their destruction and silencing any potential defenders. He needed to poison the well of their reputation, and for this dark task, he had the perfect instrument. That instrument was Guillaume de Nogaret. Nogaret was Philip's keeper of the seals, his chief minister, his ruthless enforcer. He was not a nobleman of the old school but a man forged in the new world of secular, university-trained law, a servant of the state whose loyalty to the crown was absolute and fanatical. His devotion may have been sharpened by personal history. It was rumored that his own grandfather had been burned as a heretic during the Church's crusade against the Cathars in southern France, leaving him with a deep-seated animosity towards independent ecclesiastical power. Novgorod was the architect of the vicious propaganda campaign against Pope Boniface VIII. And he was the man who had personally led the raid at Onogny. He was a master of legal manipulation, a brilliant propagandist, and a man utterly devoid of scruple when acting in the service of his king. The campaign against the Templars began not with public accusations, but with carefully planted whispers. It was a slow, insidious process. The architects of the conspiracy began to seek out and cultivate disgruntled or expelled members of the order, men who had been kicked out for theft, indiscipline, or other infractions, and who now harbored a bitter resentment. The most significant of these was a man named Escu de Floiron, a former Templar from the south of France who had a history of making accusations against the order to various authorities. For years, his stories had been dismissed as the ramblings of a disgraced man seeking revenge or reward. But now, in the court of Philip the Fair, he found a receptive audience. Novgorod and his agents began to collect and embellish these stories, weaving them into a coherent and terrifying tapestry of heresy. The whispers started to spread through the arteries of the kingdom. A rumor here, an insinuation there. Perhaps you heard it from a merchant who had dealings with a disgruntled Templar sergeant. Perhaps a friar mentioned it in a hushed conversation. The stories preyed on the Templars' most obvious vulnerability, their secrecy. For 2 centuries, their initiation rituals and chapter meetings had been conducted behind locked doors. No outsider was ever permitted to witness them. This secrecy, intended to protect their internal affairs and maintain their mystique, now became a dark, empty canvas onto which the most lurid fantasies could be painted. What really went on in their remote commanderies at night? The whispers provided the answers. They said that new recruits were forced to deny Jesus Christ, to spit or urinate on the crucifix to prove their absolute loyalty to the order over the church. They spoke of obscene rituals, of a mandatory kiss of shame given on the lower spine, the navel, or the mouth. They hinted at institutionalized homosexuality, a charge designed to cause maximum revulsion in the deeply conservative society of the time. And then there was the most sinister and exotic accusation of all, the worship of a mysterious idol. The stories claimed that in their secret chapters, the Templars brought out a strange, disembodied head, an idol they called Baphomet. They were said to worship this head, believing it had the power to make them rich and make the land fertile. The descriptions of Baphomet were vague and contradictory. Sometimes it had 1 face, sometimes 3, sometimes it was a gilded wooden head, sometimes a skull, but the vagueness only made it more terrifying. It was a charge of pure idolatry, the most profound heresy imaginable, placing the Templars in league not with God, but with the devil. This slow, deliberate campaign of slander was designed to do 2 things. First, it created a foundation of public suspicion. By the time the official accusations were made, they would not seem to come out of nowhere. They would simply confirm the dark rumors that had already been circulating for months. Second, and more importantly, it provided Philip with the ammunition he needed to pressure the Pope. Novgorod began presenting this evidence. collected from his network of informants. To a reluctant and fearful Pope Clement V, he framed the issue not as a matter of state finance, but as a grave spiritual emergency. The very soul of Christendom was at risk. He argued, a holy order had been corrupted from within, becoming a secret nest of devil worshippers. The Pope, already living in Philip's shadow at Avignon, was caught in an impossible position. To ignore such grave accusations would be a dereliction of his holy duty. But to act against the Templars, his own personal soldiers, on the word of Philip's agents, was a terrifying prospect. While Clement hesitated, paralyzed by indecision, Philip and Novgorod prepared to seize the initiative. They had laid the groundwork of fear and suspicion. They had compiled a list of charges so heinous that they would shock the conscience of Europe. The whispers in the dark had done their work. They had transformed the Templars in the public imagination from pious, if arrogant, soldiers into a monstrous secret society. The stage was now set for the next, and most audacious, part of the plan, a secret, coordinated strike to decapitate the order in a single blow. The whispers were about to become a roar. The whispers were about to become a roar, while Pope Clement V remained trapped in a state of frightened indecision. Philip the Fair and Guillaume de Novgorod decided to force his hand. They understood that a lengthy, public investigation conducted by the Church would be unpredictable. It could get bogged down in legal challenges. Allow the Templars time to rally their powerful supporters across Europe, and most critically, give them an opportunity to move their legendary treasure beyond the king's reach. A conventional approach was too slow and too risky. Philip needed a solution that was swift, total, and irreversible. He would not ask for permission. He would act first and create a reality so damning that the Pope would have no choice but to ratify it. The plan they conceived was one of stunning logistical complexity and breathtaking audacity, requiring a level of centralized coordination that few medieval kingdoms could have achieved. It was a mirror image of the successful operation against the Jews in 1306. But on a far more dangerous scale. The Templars were not simply merchants, they were a trained and disciplined military force, housed in fortified commanderies across the country. A direct, overt assault would be met with armed resistance, leading to a bloody civil war that Philip could not afford. The key, therefore, was absolute secrecy and the element of surprise. Throughout the late summer and early autumn of 1307, the royal bureaucracy whirred into silent, deadly motion. Under the direction of Novgorod, clerks in the royal chancery began drafting hundreds of identical letters. These were not mere requests or summons, they were sealed royal orders, addressed by name to every baillie and seneschal, the king's chief administrative and judicial officers, in every district of France. Each letter contained the same chilling set of instructions: to secretly compile a list of all Templar properties and personnel within their jurisdiction, to quietly assemble a force of armed men, and to prepare to act on a specific future date. The level of secrecy required was immense. These letters were dispatched across the kingdom via trusted royal messengers, Each officer who received one was placed under the severest oaths of silence. They were told that they were acting on a matter of the highest importance to the security of the realm and the purity of the faith, and that any breach of confidence would be treated as treason. The couriers fanned out across France, traveling the Roman roads and dusty tracks, carrying with them the warrants for an empire's destruction. The final, crucial element was the timing. A single, coordinated strike was essential. If the arrests began in one part of France before another, word would inevitably spread, allowing Templars in other regions to escape, to fortify their positions, or, most importantly, to hide their assets. To prevent this, each sealed letter contained a masterstroke of conspiratorial planning. The local officials were strictly forbidden from opening the final, inner letter containing the ultimate command until a specific, appointed day. They were to hold the sealed orders, make their preparations in secret, and wait. As the date approached, Philip played his part with masterful duplicity. He maintained a facade of normalcy and even friendship with the Templar leadership. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, had recently arrived in France from Cyprus at the Pope's request to discuss plans for a new crusade. De Molay was an old man, a veteran of the wars in the East, proud and perhaps a little naive about the treacherous currents of European politics. He seems to have had no inkling of the danger he was in. In the very days leading up to the ambush, he was treated as an honored guest by the king. He consulted with Philip on official matters. He stood by the king's side as a pallbearer at the funeral of Philip's sister-in-law. This public display of royal favor was a deliberate and cynical act of misdirection, designed to lull the Templars into a false sense of security, ensuring they would be completely unprepared for the blow that was about to fall. Imagine the tension in the halls of the Louvre Palace as the appointed day drew near. Philip and Nogarid were holding a tightly coiled spring, a conspiracy involving hundreds of officials scattered across a vast kingdom, any one of whom could, through incompetence or conscience, betray the secret. They were staking the authority and stability of the crown on a single, perfectly synchronized move. It was an unprecedented gamble. And so, across France, the secret letters lay waiting in the hands of royal officials. The armed men were quietly mustered. The lists of names and properties were complete. In their commanderies, the Templars went about their daily routines of prayer, administration, and training, blissfully unaware that they were being watched, counted, and targeted. They were surrounded by an invisible net, its strings all leading back to a single room in Paris where a cold-eyed king and his ruthless minister waited for the dawn. The secret order was in place. The trap was set. All that was left was to spring it. All that was left was to spring it. The date chosen for this unprecedented operation would echo through history with a superstitious dread. It was Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307. Before the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, a silent, coordinated movement began all across the Kingdom of France. In hundreds of towns and villages, the king's men, the bailies and seneschals, broke the wax seals on their secret orders. The final command was now revealed. Stark and absolute, they were to proceed immediately to the Templar houses in their districts, surround them, and arrest every single member of the order. From the highest-ranking knight to the lowliest servant, they were to use whatever force was necessary, to allow no one to escape, and to immediately seize all property, goods, and records in the name of the king. The operation unfolded with terrifying speed and efficiency. The element of surprise was total. In Paris, the nerve center of the kingdom, the grand and formidable Paris Temple was the primary target. This was more than a monastery, it was a massive, fortified citadel, the financial heart of the order and a repository of immense wealth. Royal soldiers surrounded its high walls in the pre-dawn gloom. As the city began to stir, they stormed the gates. The Templars inside, many of them still asleep or preparing for morning prayers, were caught completely off guard. They were warriors, but they were not prepared for an attack from their own king. In their own city, there was no organized resistance. They were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the shock of the assault. The Grand Master himself, the elderly Jacques de Molay, who only days before had been an honored guest of the king, was arrested in his own bedchambers. He and dozens of his highest-ranking knights were led out in chains. Bewildered and humiliated, as the king's men swarmed through the fortress, seizing everything they could find. This same scene was repeated, with minor variations, in every corner of the kingdom. In the rural preceptories, small detachments of armed men roused the local Templar brothers from their sleep. In the larger commanderies, the royal officials, who had been neighbors and associates of the Templars for years, now appeared at their gates with soldiers and warrants. The shock and betrayal must have been profound. The Templars were a proud, disciplined military order, but they were not an occupying army. They lived as part of the fabric of French society. They were unprepared for war against their own countrymen, orchestrated by the very monarch many of them had served. The success of Philip's plan was staggering. In a single morning, the entire operational structure of the Knights Templar in France, the most powerful and wealthy branch of the order, was decapitated and paralyzed. Thousands of members, from knights and sergeants to priests and laborers, were rounded up and herded into royal prisons. Their lands, their farms, their mills, their horses, their armor, their chapels, everything was seized and placed under royal administration. The great and powerful order that had stood for 2 centuries as a pillar of Christendom had, in the space of a few hours, been broken. The event sent a seismic shockwave across Europe. No one could believe it. It was as if a force of nature had been suddenly and inexplicably brought to heel. But Philip and Nogaret knew that the arrests were only the beginning. A physical victory was not enough, they needed a moral one. They had to justify this unprecedented act to a stunned world and, most importantly, to the Pope. The moment the prison doors slammed shut, the second phase of their operation began, the campaign of public confession and condemnation. The prisoners, isolated from each other and disoriented by the shock of their arrest, were now at the mercy of the king's interrogators, and the institution Philip would use to extract the necessary truth was the most feared and efficient organization for producing confessions in the medieval world, the Inquisition. Although the arrests had been a royal initiative, Philip quickly handed the prisoners over to the inquisitors, led by the Grand Inquisitor of France, a man who was a loyal servant of the king. This gave the proceedings a veneer of religious legitimacy. It transformed a royal asset seizure into a holy inquiry into heresy. The prisoners were no longer just men arrested by a king. They were suspected heretics under investigation by the Church. And under the rules of the Inquisition, the interrogators had a terrifying array of tools at their disposal to find the truth they were looking for. The physical chains were just the beginning. The psychological and spiritual torment was about to begin. The psychological and spiritual torment was about to begin. The iron doors of the royal dungeons had slammed shut, separating the Knights Templar from the world, from each other, and from any hope of aid. They were now isolated subjects in a vast and terrifying legal experiment. And the charges leveled against them were the primary instrument of their destruction. The list of accusations, formally read to the stunned prisoners, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a meticulously crafted blend of the plausible, the shocking, and the utterly surreal, designed to horrify the public and break the will of the accused. The charges were numerous, numbering over 100 in some versions, but they revolved around a core of profoundly blasphemous acts. At the center of it all was the accusation of apostasy at the very moment of initiation. The king's men claimed that every man who joined the order was forced to participate in a secret ceremony where he would deny Jesus Christ as a false prophet. To seal this renunciation, he was allegedly commanded to spit, or in some lurid versions, urinate upon a crucifix. This was the foundational charge, the one that struck at the very heart of their identity as a Christian order. It transformed their white mantle with its red cross from a symbol of martyrdom into a cloak for monstrous hypocrisy. Building upon this core of blasphemy was the charge of idolatry. The vague whispers about a mysterious head were now codified into a formal accusation. The Templars, it was claimed, worshipped an idol in their secret chapter meetings. This idol, a bearded male head, was referred to as Baphomet. This name, which has no clear origin and appears nowhere before the Templar trials, was itself a masterstroke of propaganda. It sounded foreign, sinister, and vaguely Islamic, playing on the fears of a society long at war with the Saracens. The interrogators claimed the Templars believed this head had supernatural powers, that it could speak, that it made them wealthy, that it caused the trees to blossom and the land to be fertile. It was a charge of pure paganism, designed to paint the Templars not just as heretics, but as members of a pre-Christian death cult. Then came the accusations of institutionalized perversion, designed to provoke moral revulsion. The indictment alleged that the secret initiation ceremony included a series of obscene ritual kisses. The recruit was allegedly forced to kiss the prior who received him on the mouth, on the navel, and, most shockingly, on the base of the spine. These kisses of shame were presented as proof of the order's debauchery. Furthermore, the charges claimed that the rule of the order implicitly or explicitly sanctioned homosexual acts between the brothers. They were allegedly told that it was not a sin to lie with one another, a claim that preyed upon the anxieties of an all-male, secretive military society and twisted their vow of fraternal love into something sinister and unnatural. Finally, there was a raft of financial and procedural accusations. The priests of the order, it was claimed, did not properly consecrate the host during Mass, thus invalidating the central sacrament of the Church for the entire brotherhood. The Grand Master and other high officials were accused of granting absolution for sins, a power reserved for priests and bishops, proving their arrogant usurpation of clerical authority. And, of course, they were accused of immense greed, of acquiring their vast wealth through illicit means and conspiring to defraud kings and commoners alike. This litany of horrors served multiple purposes. For the general public, it created a narrative so monstrous that the king's extreme actions seemed not only justified, but necessary. How could anyone defend an order that spat on the cross and worshipped a demonic head? For the prisoners themselves, the charges were a form of psychological disorientation. A knight arrested for treason might resist, but a knight accused of a dizzying array of blasphemies he could barely comprehend would be thrown into a state of confusion and spiritual despair. The charges were designed to be impossible to refute. How does one prove they didn't worship a head in a secret meeting that no outsider ever witnessed? The burden of proof was reversed. The Templars were not presumed innocent. Their guilt was the starting premise of the entire investigation. The purpose of the trials was not to discover the truth, but to produce confessions that would validate the accusations that had already been written. And the inquisitors, now taking charge of the prisoners, had centuries of experience in the art of extracting just such confessions. The inquisitors, now taking charge of the prisoners, had centuries of experience in the art of extracting just such confessions. The Templars were moved from the royal dungeons to the custody of the Inquisition, and with this transfer, their ordeal entered a new and more terrible phase. They were now in a system where guilt was assumed and the confession was seen not as an admission of a crime, but as a therapeutic act for the soul of the heretic, an act that was to be achieved by any means necessary. The primary tool for achieving this end was torture. The methods used were varied, brutal, and scientifically designed to break the human body and spirit. One of the most common was the strappado, where the prisoner's hands were tied behind his back, and the rope was slung over a pulley. He would be hoisted into the air, dislocating his shoulders with an agonizing tearing of ligaments. He could be left hanging for long periods, or repeatedly dropped and jerked to a halt, sending waves of blinding pain through his body. Another favored technique involved the feet. The prisoner would be bound to a frame, and the soles of his feet would be greased with animal fat. A brazier of hot coals would then be pushed close, slowly roasting the flesh from his bones. When the pain became unbearable and the prisoner fainted or agreed to confess, the fire would be moved away, If he recanted, the process would begin again. Men were known to have been tortured so severely with this method that the charred bones of their feet simply fell away when they were released. There was also the rack, a wooden frame where the victim's ankles and wrists were tied to rollers at opposite ends. The rollers would be turned, slowly stretching the body, pulling joints from their sockets and ripping muscles and tendons. And beyond the physical agony was the psychological torment, sleep deprivation, starvation, being kept in damp, lightless oubliettes, and the constant, relentless pressure of questioning by inquisitors who told them that their brothers had already confessed to everything. They were told that a swift confession would lead to reconciliation with the Church and mercy, while stubborn denial would only lead to more pain and, ultimately, the stake. Under this unendurable pressure, the will of even the strongest men began to crumble. One by one, the confessions began. Knights who had faced down Saracen armies without flinching now found themselves broken by a torment that was intimate, systematic, and inescapable. They began to admit to the charges. Yes, they had denied Christ. Yes, they had spat on the crucifix, though many added qualifiers in their desperation, saying they had spat near it, not on it, or that they had done so with their mouths but not with their hearts. They admitted to the obscene kisses. Some even confessed to worshipping the mysterious head, though their descriptions of it varied wildly. A clear sign that they were simply repeating what their torturers wanted to hear. The most significant prize for the prosecution was the confession of the Grand Master himself. Jacques de Molay, the elderly knight, subjected to the immense pressure of his own suffering and the knowledge that his men were being systematically broken, also confessed. His confession, though likely obtained under duress and filled with ambiguities, was a devastating blow to the order. If the Grand Master himself admitted to heresy, how could the organization be innocent? Philip the Fair now had what he needed. He had a mountain of confessions, including one from the very head of the order. He quickly had these confessions read out publicly in Paris, cementing the narrative of Templar guilt in the mind of the public and presenting the Pope with a seemingly undeniable body of evidence. But the process was not perfect. Many Templars resisted with incredible fortitude. Dozens died under torture without ever confessing. Others, in a desperate attempt to fight back, tried to use the legal process itself. When the Pope, finally stirring to action, insisted on his own papal commission to investigate the matter, hundreds of Templars who had confessed under royal torture seized the opportunity. They found their courage and formally recanted their confessions, stating that they had been extracted through unbearable pain and the fear of death. They declared the innocence of the order and their readiness to defend it. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. This mass recantation was a serious threat to Philip's entire case. It exposed the brutal methods used to obtain the evidence and threatened to derail the proceedings. Philip's response was swift, brutal, and decisive. He declared that any Templar who recanted a confession was a relapsed heretic, a crime for which there was only one punishment. On a single day in May 1310, 54 Knights Templar who had dared to retract their confessions were taken to a field outside Paris, bound to stakes, and slowly burned to death. This horrific mass execution was a clear and brutal message to every other Templar in custody. You can defend the order and burn, or you can uphold your confession and live. The effect was immediate and devastating. The will to resist was shattered. The organized defense of the order collapsed. The prisoners fell silent, trapped between a false confession and a fiery death. The king's truth would now stand, written in the ashes of those who had dared to defy it. The king's truth would now stand, written in the ashes of those who had dared to defy it. The fate of the Knights Templar as an organization was now sealed. With the organized defense crushed and a mountain of coerced confessions in hand, Philip the Fair increased his pressure on Pope Clement V at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Philip arrived with a military escort, a clear show of force, though many of the churchmen present were still skeptical of the Templars' guilt. The Pope was too weak and too intimidated to resist the king's will. Clement did not officially declare the order heretical, a move that would have required a formal trial he knew they might win, but instead chose a legal loophole. He issued a papal bull, Vox in excelso, that officially suppressed the order. He argued that because of the scandal, the disgrace, and the confessions, even if they were false, the Order of the Temple could no longer serve its purpose and its continued existence was a stain on the Church. It was a dissolution based on reputation, not on proven guilt. With the stroke of a pen, the Knights Templar, as a legal and ecclesiastical body, ceased to exist. Their vast properties were ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. Though King Philip ensured a huge portion was diverted to the French crown to cover the costs of the lengthy investigation, effectively achieving his primary financial goal. For most of the imprisoned Templars, the end of the order meant a grim, quiet fate. Those who had confessed and stuck to their stories were sentenced to life in prison, left to rot away in monastic or royal dungeons. But for the leaders of the order, a final, public drama was yet to unfold. The four highest-ranking dignitaries, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, the Master of Normandy, Geoffroy de Charnay, the Master of Aquitaine, Geoffroy de Gonville, and the Master of Poitou, Godefroy de Pontoise, had been languishing in prison for nearly 7 years. On March 18, 1314, these 4 men were led out onto a specially constructed scaffold erected in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. A commission of cardinals was there to deliver their final sentence. They were to be officially declared guilty and condemned to perpetual imprisonment. The 2 lesser dignitaries, Gonville and Pontoise, silently accepted their fate, but as the sentence was being read, something inside the elderly Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, finally broke. After 7 years of imprisonment, after witnessing the complete destruction of the order he had led, after the shame of his own coerced confession, he found a final, defiant surge of courage. He stood up on the scaffold, before the assembled crowd and the stunned cardinals, and his voice, loud and clear, rang out across the square. He proclaimed that he was not guilty of the crimes he was charged with. He declared that the order of the temple was pure and holy. He confessed only to the one great sin of his life, the sin of betraying his brothers and his order to save his own life, by making a false confession under duress. He retracted his confession completely and utterly. Inspired by his leader's courage, Geoffroy de Charnay immediately did the same, shouting his own innocence and the innocence of the temple. King Philip, who was present in his palace nearby, was enraged by this public defiance. His carefully orchestrated show trial had been shattered at its final moment. His reaction was immediate and merciless. There would be no new trial. By recanting their confessions, de Molay and de Charnay were, in the eyes of the law, relapsed heretics. The sentence was automatic: death. That very evening, as dusk fell over Paris, the two men were taken to a small island in the river Seine. The Île aux Juifs, a place where Jewish heretics had been burned before. The pyres had been prepared. They were bound to the stakes. According to one account, de Molay asked to be tied facing the towers of Notre Dame, and he met his end in prayer, without a cry of pain. But it is what he is reputed to have said from amidst the flames that has cemented his place in legend. As the fire consumed him, it is said that Jacques de Molay raised his voice one last time, not to cry out in agony, but to issue a final, terrible summons. He called out to his betrayers, issuing a curse from the threshold of death. He summoned Pope Clement V to appear before the judgment seat of God within 40 days. And he summoned King Philip IV to join him there within the year. He declared that a great calamity would soon befall the king's entire lineage. Whether the curse was real or legend that grew in the aftermath, what followed was chilling. Pope Clement V, who had been suffering from a debilitating illness, died in agony just over a month later, on April 20, 1314, and King Philip the Fair, the powerful and seemingly invincible monarch, suffered a cerebral hemorrhage after falling from his horse during a hunt later that same year. He died in November 1314, well within the year stipulated by the curse. The calamities for his house did not stop there. Within 14 years of the curse, all three of Philip's sons would rule and die without producing a male heir, bringing the direct line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries, to an abrupt and calamitous end. The curse of the last Grand Master seemed to have been fulfilled with terrifying precision. The curse of the last Grand Master seemed to have been fulfilled with terrifying precision. The architects of the Templars' destruction were dead, and the royal house of France was set on a path to ruin. But the spectacular deaths of a pope and a king did not solve the most tangible and frustrating mystery left in the wake of the arrests. While King Philip had succeeded in capturing the Templars' bodies, their most coveted prize, the legendary treasure of the order, had inexplicably vanished. When the king's men stormed the Paris temple on that fateful Friday morning, they had expected to find a vault overflowing with gold, silver, jewels, and precious relics. The Paris Temple was, after all, the central treasury not only for the order in France but effectively for the French monarchy itself. It was a repository of immense wealth. The royal officials meticulously seized the buildings, the lands, the armor, the horses, and the extensive financial records, ledgers that detailed the debts owed to the order by kings and nobles across Europe. These records were a treasure in their own right, and Philip would use them to enrich his crown. But the vast, liquid wealth, the literal tons of gold and silver bullion that were supposed to be the grand prize of the entire operation, were simply not there. The vaults were nearly empty. This discovery must have been a source of immense frustration for the king. He had torn down one of the pillars of Christendom, but the gold had slipped through his fingers. The question immediately arose: where did it go? And more importantly, how? The operation had been a model of secrecy and speed. How could the Templars, who were caught so completely by surprise, have had time to move a treasure of that magnitude? The answer seems to lie in the days just before the arrests. According to the later testimony of a Templar named Jean de Chalon, a number of wagons were seen leaving the Paris Temple under the cover of darkness. Just a few nights before the raid, these wagons, heavily laden and under the guard of a handful of trusted knights, rumbled out of the city and disappeared into the French countryside. It suggests that despite the king's elaborate deceptions, someone within the order had received a warning. Perhaps a contact in the royal court, a sympathetic official, or simply a well-placed spy, had leaked word of the impending disaster. It wasn't enough time to warn the entire order or to organize a resistance. But it was just enough time to save the treasure. The ultimate destination of these wagons remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. But the disappearance of the gold was only part of the puzzle. An even larger and more significant asset vanished without a trace: the entire Templar fleet. The Knights Templar were not just a land-based power. Over 2 centuries, they had built and commanded a massive fleet of ships. Their ports, especially the great Atlantic port of La Rochelle on the western coast of France, were hubs of international commerce and military logistics. Their ships ferried pilgrims, transported goods, moved money, and supplied their armies in the east. This fleet was a strategic asset of immense value, controlled by men with unparalleled knowledge of the seas and navigation. And on the morning of October 13, 1307, when royal officials arrived at La Rochelle and other Templar ports to seize their assets, they found the harbors empty. The entire fleet had set sail. There is no official record of their departure, no log of their destination. They had simply hoisted their sails in the days or hours before the arrests and vanished over the horizon. This coordinated disappearance of both the treasure and the fleet points to a well-organized, secret contingency plan. It suggests that the Templars, a famously prudent and far-sighted organization, had long prepared for a worst-case scenario. They may not have anticipated a betrayal from the King of France specifically, but they understood that their immense wealth and power made them a target. It is entirely plausible that they had protocols in place to protect their assets in the event of a catastrophic political or military threat. The escape of the fleet opens up a world of tantalizing possibilities. A fleet of ships, crewed by disciplined mariners and soldiers, and carrying a vast fortune, could go anywhere. They were no longer bound by the political map of Europe. They could have sailed to Portugal, where King Dinas was friendly to the order and would later simply reform the Templars under a new name, the Order of Christ. They could have sailed to Scotland, which was at that time under papal excommunication and therefore a safe haven from any decrees issued by Pope Clement. The Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, was locked in a desperate war for independence against England and would have welcomed the support of elite warriors and their considerable treasury. Or perhaps they sailed somewhere else entirely, beyond the known boundaries of the medieval world. The fleet, its treasure, and the knights who escaped the purge slipped through Philip's net and into the realm of legend. They left behind a frustrated king, an empty vault, and a mystery that would fuel speculation, treasure hunts, and conspiracy theories for the next 700 years. The physical body of the order had been broken, but its wealth and a core of its members had seemingly escaped, becoming a ghost fleet on a sea of possibilities. The physical body of the order had been broken, but its wealth and a core of its members had seemingly escaped, becoming a ghost fleet on a sea of possibilities. The question of where they went has since become a fertile ground for historians, novelists, and treasure hunters, spawning a host of theories that range from the historically plausible to the fantastically imaginative. One of the most compelling and historically grounded theories points northward, to the war-torn Kingdom of Scotland. At the time of the Templar arrests in 1307, Scotland was in a unique position. Its king, Robert the Bruce, was in the midst of a brutal war of independence against King Edward of England. Crucially, both Robert the Bruce and his entire kingdom were under a papal interdict, a form of excommunication. This meant that the Pope's decree suppressing the Templar order held no legal authority in Scotland. It was, in effect, a lawless zone in the eyes of the Church, making it a perfect sanctuary for knights fleeing persecution. The Templars had long-standing and significant landholdings in Scotland. There is strong evidence that many Scottish Templars were never arrested and that the order's structure there remained largely intact. The theory posits that the Templar fleet, laden with its treasure, sailed to Scotland and placed itself and its resources at the service of Robert the Bruce. Proponents of this theory point to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. A pivotal and stunning victory for the vastly outnumbered Scots against the English. Some chronicles and popular legends speak of a mysterious, fresh contingent of well-armed horsemen who entered the battle at a critical moment, turning the tide in favor of the Scots. The theory suggests these were not fresh troops, but the Templar Knights, deploying their signature heavy cavalry charge one last time in history, not for the Holy Land, but for a Scottish king who had given them refuge. Another highly plausible destination was Portugal. King Dinas of Portugal had a much friendlier relationship with the Templars than Philip did. He valued their military prowess and their role in the ongoing Reconquista. The effort to drive the Moorish kingdoms out of the Iberian Peninsula. When the Pope suppressed the order, King Dinas delayed and negotiated. He refused to persecute the Templars in his kingdom. Instead, after a few years, he simply reformed them. In 1319, with papal approval, he created a new order, the Order of Christ, which inherited all of the Templars' properties, personnel, and, it is believed, their secrets and maritime knowledge. The famous cross of the Order of Christ, a red cross with a white cross at its center, adorned the sails of Portuguese ships during the Great Age of Discovery a century later. It is a tantalizing thought that the great navigational and financial power of the Templars did not die, but was simply rebranded, providing the seed money and expertise that would eventually allow explorers like Vasco da Gama and Henry the Navigator to open up the sea routes to India and beyond. But it is the more speculative theories that have most captured the public imagination. These theories look at the Templars' advanced knowledge of cartography and navigation, their extensive trade networks, and their access to maps and information from the East, and ask, what if they knew more about the world than was commonly understood? One theory suggests that the Templar fleet did not stop in Scotland or Portugal, but used their knowledge and treasure to finance a much longer journey. Sailing west, across the Atlantic Ocean, proponents point to strange carvings and architectural symbols in chapels and ruins. From the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland with its alleged carvings of maize and aloe vera, plants unknown in Europe before Columbus, to mysterious Templar-like symbols found among some Native American tribes. The theory suggests that the Templars, or their descendants, reached the Americas nearly a century before Christopher Columbus, perhaps establishing a secret colony in what is now Nova Scotia or New England. They might have been searching for a new, hidden promised land, a place to rebuild their order far from the scheming kings and popes of Europe. While there is no definitive archaeological proof for this theory, it remains a powerful and romantic idea that the Templar legacy did not just survive, but discovered a new world, whether their treasure lies buried beneath a chapel in Scotland, funded the Portuguese Empire, or crossed the Atlantic to be lost in the vastness of the Americas. The disappearance of the Templar fleet and its cargo created a vacuum that was quickly filled by legend. The escaped knights became the keepers of a great secret, the guardians of not just gold, but perhaps of a sacred knowledge or a holy relic, like the legendary Holy Grail, which some theories connect to the order. The Templars were no longer just a historical institution, they had become a myth. Their story became a foundational legend for later secret societies, most notably the Freemasons, who would adopt Templar symbols and claim a direct, if unproven, lineage back to the persecuted knights. The truth of what happened to the last of the Templars and their treasure may never be fully known. It is likely a combination of these theories, some knights likely integrated into other orders in Spain and Portugal. Some may have found refuge in Scotland, while others simply faded into civilian life. The treasure was likely broken up and dispersed, some hidden, some spent, some lost forever, but the mystery itself is perhaps their most enduring legacy. They disappeared into the fog of history, leaving behind a story of immense power, catastrophic betrayal, and a ghost fleet sailing forever toward an unknown shore. They disappeared into the fog of history, leaving behind a story of immense power, catastrophic betrayal, and a ghost fleet sailing forever toward an unknown shore. And so, our journey through the fall of the Knights Templar comes to a close. We have walked in the pre-dawn gloom of Paris on the eve of their destruction, traced their humble origins on the dusty roads to Jerusalem, and stood witness to their fiery end on a small island in the Seine. We have seen how a brotherhood born of piety became an empire of finance, and how that very success made them a target for a ruthless king. The Order of the Temple was officially erased from history by a papal decree. Its members killed or scattered, its properties seized. By every practical measure, King Philip the Fair had won. He had eliminated a powerful rival, asserted the dominance of his throne over all other authorities in his realm, and filled his coffers with a portion of their immense wealth. He had set a terrifying precedent for the power of the centralized state against an independent, transnational organization. In the cold, hard logic of history, his operation was a stunning success. But history is more than a record of victors and vanquished. It is also a story of ideas, of legends, and of the ghosts that refuse to fade. And in this sense, the Templars did not truly disappear. By destroying their physical body so brutally and so publicly, Philip inadvertently ensured their immortality. He transformed them from a historical institution into a powerful and enduring myth. Their story became a cautionary tale, a grand medieval tragedy of hubris, greed, and innocence betrayed. The image of the noble knight, falsely accused and burned at the stake, became a powerful symbol of martyrdom in the face of tyranny. The curse of Jacques de Molay, whether real or apocryphal, resonated deeply with a popular desire for justice from beyond the grave. A belief that such profound wrongs could not go unpunished. The mystery of their lost treasure and secret knowledge provided fertile ground for the human imagination. The Templars evolved into the archetypal secret society, the keepers of ancient and forbidden wisdom. They became inextricably linked with the quest for the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and the secrets of Solomon's Temple. This romantic vision of the Templars as mystical guardians, rather than as warrior bankers, proved to be far more powerful and lasting than their actual historical role. This legend was so potent that other organizations sought to claim it as their own. In the 18th century, the burgeoning order of the Freemasons, looking to create a distinguished and ancient lineage for their own rituals, adopted and incorporated the Templar story into their higher degrees. They created rights and titles like the Order of the Temple and the Knight Templar, claiming a spiritual, if not a direct historical, descent from the persecuted knights. Through them, and through countless other esoteric groups, the symbols and legends of the Templars were kept alive, passed down through generations, and woven into the very fabric of Western esotericism. Today, The Knights Templar are more famous and more present in our culture than they ever were in the centuries immediately following their suppression. We see their white mantles and red crosses in blockbuster films, in best-selling novels, and in popular video games. The name, Templar, has become a byword for a powerful, secretive conspiracy, a hidden hand guiding the course of history. The real Knights Templar were, of course, men of their time. They were complex figures, pious yet violent, disciplined yet proud, innovative yet ultimately vulnerable. Their story is a stark reminder that power, no matter how great, is always precarious, that faith can be manipulated into a weapon, and that the line between a hero and a heretic can be as thin as a king's ambition. As the night deepens and our story ends, let us leave them where we found them, suspended between history and myth. Perhaps the truth is not hidden in a single location, not in a vault in Scotland or a lost colony across the sea. Perhaps the real treasure the Templars left behind was their own story, a haunting, unanswered question that continues to challenge and fascinate us, an eternal mystery that echoes from the heart of the Middle Ages. Thank you for listening. May your rest be peaceful, and your dreams be filled with the faint, lingering whispers of history.